All right, so this chapter covers a lot of different rhetorical styles, but you can really only learn them by identifying them and practicing them in your own writing. And since these aren't very complicated concepts, they're probably just unfamiliar to you. I'm just going to kind of review what the textbook lays out, and then we'll just practice more in class. So this should be a shorter video. First off, which ones are we talking about? We're talking about the stylistic moves that they brought up: absolute phrases, polysyndeton, asyndeton, repetition, word order variation, ellipsis, antithesis, and then the deliberate fragment. Now, the absolute phrase, this is probably the most important stylistic device to learn, and it's also the most grammatically complex, so we're going to kind of spend a little bit more time on it. Absolute phrases are very similar to participial phrases, but instead of taking the subject of the sentence as their implied subject, these phrases actually have their own subject. They're almost their own clauses, except they don't have a tensed verb. It might look like they do because we use these participles when we use the progressive tenses or the perfect tenses, but they are in fact just, well, they're not even quite participial phrases. They're kind of their own separate phrase because they're not adjectivals. In fact, if you ever do diagramming of sentences, the absolute phrase is kind of on its own in a way. So let's just look at a couple of examples. He raced to the finish line, his lungs heaving. So his lungs, this is the subject of the absolute phrase. Heaving is the verb. It looks like a tense verb, but it is not. The only tense verb here is raced. Next one, the crowd cheered him on, their banners waving wildly. Their banners is the subject, waving is the verb of the absolute phrase. Notice how in both of these, it is set off by commas. You do set off the absolute phrase by commas. And we could potentially move this around, right? The crowd, their banners waving wildly, cheered him on. That works fine. Finally, hands clasped tightly, his mother prayed for victory. So this is an example where we use the past participial rather than the progressive participial, the present participial. Clasp being that past one, hands being the subject of this absolute phrase. And then here we have the independent clause. So again, they look like their own clause and they're almost basically their own clause, but you do fold them into other independent clauses with commas by using instead the participial, either the present or the past. Okay, polysyndeton and asyndeton, these are just really big words to say using all coordinating conjunctions in place of commas or not using coordinating conjunctions. Poly being that Greek term or Greek, excuse me, phrase, word, suffix, whatever, prefix here that indicate everything or lots. And so we use it when we're using lots of coordinating conjunctions. So out on the road, the pilgrim sank down and fell over and died, and the bleak and shrouded earth went trundling past the sun and returned again as trackless and as unremarked as the path of any nameless sister world in the ancient dark beyond. A great, great line from Cormac McCarthy's The Road, a terrific book, if totally depressing. Maybe a good time to read during pandemic time. So that would be an example where we just see coordinating conjunction one after another. Now, asyndeton is when you have the opposite of that. He was a bag of bones, a floppy doll, a broken stick, a maniac. Now, normally when we have a series of coordinating conjunctions, we don't use one until the very end anyways, so it might not stand out quite as much. But when you do drop that last coordinating conjunction, then it really does make that impact. So the missing and here is what makes this an asyndeton. All right, repetition, this is a familiar enough word, but here what we mean is when a writer repeats the same grammatical form over and over for effect. So this example from Winston Churchill: we shall go on to the end, we shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. So Churchill repeats the subject and verb several times, right? We shall, or we shall fight. But he also uses a prepositional phrase at the end of his clauses over and over when he says, in the air, whatever, on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, in the streets, and so forth. He also has the repetition of growing confidence and growing strength and so forth. So he uses all different types of repetition here. Now, often repetition needs to be coordinated, so writers will choose whether or not they want to integrate coordinated conjunctions into the repetitions or not. But I think you often find examples like this where there is asyndeton, where they are not including those coordinated conjunctions. So let's just look at another passage. This is a group discussion that they want us to analyze, a passage from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. And we are trying to identify what type of stylistic devices do they use. It says, he hath disgraced me and hindered me. So this is Shylock from the play, if you're not familiar with it. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? So a lot going on here. Hopefully you notice there's a lot of asyndeton here where we're not using a lot of coordinating conjunctions. We just have comma after comma after comma here. We also have a lot of repetition where we have a series of past participles, a lot of perfect verbs, disgraced me, hindered me, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, repetition of my, repetition of me, here's another my, so forth. We also see it with, down here, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means. These almost look like absolute phrases, but again, they don't have another subject. These are actually participial phrases, just using the past participial over and over. Fed, hurt, subject, healed, warmed, all to modify the implied subject here, which is Shylock. I would also note too, one thing that hasn't been brought up yet in our studies is the sharp contrast between the long sentence and the short sentence. So we have this very long sentence, a series of coordinated verb phrases, followed up by the very short punctuated, I am a Jew. And I think that creates a really nice contrast. All right, let's move on. So we also have word order variation. We call this sometimes anastrophe or anastrophe. This is anytime we vary the grammatical order of a sentence. You know, normally we have subject, verb, direct object, that type of thing. But if we want to mix up that syntax, we would call this anastrophe. And as you can imagine, this happens most often in poetry, because in poetry, you can expect that your reader will have a little bit more patience and take a little bit more care when reading, so the anastrophe won't cause as much confusion. So, glistens the dew upon the morning grass. Here we have the subject, the dew, and it's been put after the verb. It should be the dew glistens upon the morning grass, but it sounds a little bit nicer, more poetic this way. Glistens the dew upon the morning grass. This from Samuel Taylor Coleridge. His hands dropped me, or excuse me, his hands dropped he. Maybe that's a little bit what Coleridge is trying to get at, is the implied me. He is actually the subject, dropped is the verb, and his hands is the direct object. So it's actually he dropped his hands. His hands dropped he is a way to kind of reverse all of that completely. This one is an interesting case from Gerard Manley Hopkins, where he's going to split a prepositional verb. Now, prepositional verbs, again, are verbs where you have the verb and a preposition. They have to go together. But in this case, he's going to divide them. Hope holds to Christ the man's own mirror out. So normally that would be hope holds out to Christ the mind's own mirror. But for special effect, Hopkins is going to divide that prepositional verb. So word order variation, anastrophe. Ellipsis, we probably know ellipsis most commonly from those three dots that we use to contract a quote. But we can also use it in writing when we want to drop a grammatical form and just leave it implied. When we do that, however, we usually put in a comma to signal what's missing. So John forgives Mary and Mary John. That implies that between Mary and John is actually the verb forgives. This is another good one where we don't put a comma to replace what's implied if what's implied comes at the very end of a sentence. The average person thinks he isn't. What does he not think he is? He doesn't think he's average, but we are dropping that. And so it's just ending on that note. The average person thinks he isn't. Because normally you would not end a sentence, he is not, yeah, or at least not this sentence. You'd have to complete it. But what's the subject complement of this second clause has been taken out and just left implied. Okay, antithesis. This is where we put two opposing things in grammatical parallel, creating a heightened sense of contrast. And to create that sense of parallel, the opposing ideas should be the same grammatical form, like subject, predicate, and prepositional phrase, and so forth. So to take some examples, famous ones, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Notice how small and giant are both adjectives before the nouns that they are modifying, step and leap. And notice how both of these are in contrast. So small and giant, step and leap are in kind of opposing each other. But man and mankind, a little bit more similar. So the juxtaposition really happens here, small step and giant leap. And man and mankind related, but that's how you create the effect of one man to all of humanity. I guess that's really is a contrast, one individual versus the, every person on earth. So that is a pretty strong contrast. Okay. And notice also the ellipsis. We are missing the that from right here that we have here. That's one small step for man. That's one giant leap for mankind. Doesn't have quite the same punch, so we dropped the that, or at least Neil Armstrong did. This one from Alexander Pope, a famous poet. To err is human, to forgive divine. So err and forgive, they are both infinitive nominal verb phrases functioning as the subject here, but they are opposite types of verbs, erring and forgiving. Likewise, human and divine is most definitely, opposite each other, and they are in the subject complement position. Notice how Pope has dropped the is, both for poetical meter reasons. He wants to keep that iambic pentameter. To err is human, to forgive divine, but is also just more stylistically cool that way. And he's not using the comma, though potentially he could, if it's really clear what's being dropped. And then deliberate fragments. So normally you would need a subject and a predicate in all your sentences to make them independent clauses, but for stylistic effect, you can drop one of them. And usually you need it, though, to be implied, which is what is being dropped. So usually we drop the verb, and since participial phrases are adjectivals that give nouns a sense of action, they're often used to good effect in sentence fragments, like this one. He pulled up to the abandoned warehouse. Okay, that's an independent clause. Concrete walls 40 feet high, lime green paint peeling off in tiny flakes. Notice how there's no tense verb here. We do have this participial phrase, peeling, that modifies the paint. Two windows next to the front door, smeared with dust, hiding secrets. Again, these windows are modified by these participial phrases to get it finished. And that is giving it a sense of action, or maybe not quite movement, of meaning without using a tense verb. All right. So what we'll be doing in class is looking at a few different passages and analyzing their stylistic devices. And to kind of give you a sense about what we'll be doing, I'll be looking at this example from Eula Bliss, Notes from No Man's Land, American Essays. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to talk about the different types of stylistic devices that I notice. And I might miss some, so let me know if I do. I would walk to school in the dust, on the broken sidewalks, through the stairs, past the skinny dogs that stood up and followed me with their eyes before they lay back down. I would pass the truck piled high with bunches of clean radishes, where I would buy torta for lunch and then wash my hands with the juice of a lime. I would pass shacks made of corrugated metal and lines of laundry, and a row of pickle jars full of peaches and strawberries and mangoes waiting to be poured over ice. I would read signs, and I would understand some of what I heard, but not all of it, not nearly all of it. Okay, a couple things I noticed. In this first sentence, we have Asyndeton, where there's a series of items in a list, but we're not getting the coordinating conjunctions. We also have the repetition of the I would that comes up frequently throughout this passage. And we also have down here the sentence fragment. I would understand some of what I heard, but not all of it, period. Not nearly all of it. We're actually missing both subject and verb here, right? Yeah, because it's just repeating this. I guess this would be, I would understand some of what I heard, but not, yeah, I guess like this object, what was heard, not all of it. So it's repeating this direct object. It's modifying it slightly by adding the adverb nearly, but there's no subject or verb here. So we just have that sentence fragment, but it works really well. You know what's being said. That period gives it a nice pause, a sort of dramatic moment, as it were. That's what I noticed right away. There's some polysyndeton here too, where it kind of piles on all the coordinating conjunctions, the ands. So that's happening as well. I did not notice any absolute phrases, but I might be wrong. And I didn't notice any antithesis. Yeah, nothing at least very deliberate. So we'll be looking at some more and practicing more in class. And so hopefully you'll be ready for that then.